Hi, everybody. Mary here with the Conscious Communication at Work update around empathy skills. So I want you to just start off with picturing a scenario with me. So imagine that you've got some kind of a dilemma with a project that you're working on. You go to your manager to try to talk through it. And before you finish, before you've had a chance to kind of tease out the nuances that make a difference, they start to give you suggestions. They start like, well, why don't you, have somebody take this off your plate? Or, you're like, actually, it kind of doesn't make sense to do that. That'd be more work than it would save because da 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 da. And then they take that little piece and they start making a suggestion about that. And it's just like, let me finish. Like, I want you to understand the whole problem before you try to give me a suggestion, right? Or pictured it on the other side. There's sort of like this coworker, you can tell that they're tense. You can tell that they're upset about something and they come to you, and before you know it, like this conversation is somehow like escalating, and you're frustrated because you're trying to help them out. You're giving them some ideas and you're trying to tell them it's going to be okay. But you don't know, somehow it's just not landing. It's not doing much for them. What both of these point to are what we call in nonviolent communication the use of empathy knots. And I kind of like to think of these as sort of the defaults that most of us are trained in. So in workshops, I'll ask people, hey, raise your hand if you have ever, raise your hand if you essentially get paid all day to give advice to other people, if you're a consultant of some sort, either as your full role or as part of your role. And, most of us are. So we do like to give advice. This is one of the defaults that's pretty typical. Now, in empathy, we talk about some of the things to do, and we're going to go over those as well. But I just want to kind of give you an overview of all of these empathy knots and some suggestions about how you can kind of shift them into empathy. So if you want to see this handout or print it out, there's a PDF in this same group. You'll just need to search for it. Empathy skills, empathy knots will probably do the trick. But here are some of the most common empathy knots. Some version of giving advice, either educating, coaching, offering advice, your attempt to give suggestions to try to fix it. We all do that from a place of care. That's usually the motivation, is we want to help. And for the person that's receiving advice before they feel gotten, it kind of just like can be a little bit twitchy to hear, especially if they haven't fully explained themselves, right? Or especially if you're kind of focusing on some part of the issue that is for them less relevant. I often tell this example in my workshops because, it's so like obvious in some of these cases, that I had this experience with my father who's basically now in advanced stages of dementia, and how I was venting fairly recently with somebody about like, oh my gosh, this has been hard. And, a psychiatrist for these symptoms, but because he broke his hip and he fell and, like all these things that we were having some challenges with. And I just needed to be heard. I just needed to have somebody kind of just hold space for me. And they started to jump in with like, well, what about coconut oil? Have you tried putting coconut oil in his food? Like that increases brain function. Well, what about, and they started doing this. And before long, I was like, you know what? Something in me kind of shut down. It was like, that's, don't be the coconut oil guy, right? Or gal, like in this case, it was a guy, but, that's something that's really hard when somebody's got something going on and they're not ready for advice yet. If you don't know, you can ask, hey, are you interested in some advice, or do you just want to be heard? Do you want some thoughts on that? Or are you just kind of talking through this out loud, right? So other empathy knots, they're all listed there, but I want to go over a few of my favorites Another one is reassurance. This is another one that we like to do because, frankly, a lot of times we're a little bit uncomfortable with other people being upset. And so part of us wants to like calm them down. You know, that can be a sort of like subtle motivation in there, sometimes not so subtle, like, no, it's going to be fine. You're going to be okay. Don't worry about it. You know, like this is all going to work out. That goes into spiritualizing, which is sort of this, you know, offering a philosophy that maybe that person is or isn't aligned with, but nonetheless, they may not be interested in hearing, you know, like, hey, just, you know, try to be positive, you know, so like spiritual bypass kind of stuff, right? Another one that's really interesting, and it's sort of a combination of storytelling and, you know, but it's a little different. Also, it's one-upping. It's like, oh, well, you think that's hard. You think it's hard to work from home right now during, you know, all these things that are happening on the planet. Imagine doing it in an organization that's restructuring right now, you know, where even though my intent to focus on them and offer them some care may have been there initially, I've kind of brought it back to me. That's one of the things that's often the case with these empathy knots, is that there's a way in which we're not exactly like keeping it about them. There's a way in which the focus goes from them back to ourselves, you know, and the story that we want to tell. Or this one's not on here, but another common empathy knot, or one I guess is not super common, is interrogation. You know, just like the part that's so curious and so asks question after question after question. Well, why did that happen? Well, what do you think that was about? Well, what are you going to do next? Well, you know, why? Do you think this is what he meant when he said such and such? You know, the question is really, you know, you leading the conversation, right? So what I'd love for you to do is go ahead and take a look at all of these. I'm not going to read through them because you have access to the worksheet itself. I want you to pull it up, though. The PDF is, like I said, in this group in a separate post, and in the Facebook, the NVC and Conscious Communication in the Workplace group. And I encourage you to print this one out and take a look at what are your habitual responses. You know, none of these are bad things to do. It's not like you need to like strike these out of your vocabulary. The idea, though, is to take what's a habit, what might be sort of like unconscious, and have more consciousness around whether it's working in any given situation or not, and being able to adjust. If you start to go into, like for me, I love giving advice and coaching. It's so much of what I do. And so if I notice myself doing it and I kind of like am paying attention to the other person, I'm like, oh, this isn't really landing. Let me go ahead and just back off and go back to just kind of warm, resonant listening. You know, even just that shift, that consciousness is, in my mind, what the goal is with these. Not to stop doing them altogether, but to be mindful and intentional when I do utilize them, right? Sometimes it feels really great to hear that, you know, it's going to be okay in the end. Or, you know, I do have a website that talks about just this. Do you want me to send you the link, you know, or what have you? Or do you want to hear about something that was similar in my life? You know, it's totally okay to do that at a certain point. And like I said, the idea is that it's not just this default that you're doing and no matter what result it's getting you. So take a peek at all of that, and I would love it if you would start a post and let me know, let the whole group know, start a discussion like, well, here's what came up for me. Here are my thoughts on this, or here's where I'm running into a snag, and we'll help you out. All right. Thanks, everybody.